Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's webinar, Literacy Rising in Mississippi. My name is Barbara Patterson. I'm Director of Event Marketing here at 95% Group, and we are super excited to see so many of you joining us this evening. We know that summer is upon us, and you have lots of places you could be tonight, so we're glad you chose to be with us. I'm going to turn things over to Laura Stewart, our Chief Academic Officer. Thank you, Laura.
Oh, thank you, Barbara. Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. This is really just an exciting session tonight with, I have to say, two of my favorite people. And as I look at people joining us, we have people joining us tonight from all over and from all walks of life. And it just makes me kind of reflect on the fact that all of us throughout K-12, leaders, educators, parents, families, community members, we all have a stake in making sure our students learn to read and delivering on that promise of literacy for all of our children. You know, we want all of our students to become literate citizens of the world and to reap the joys and the gifts of a literate life. And what we know from research is that 95% or more of our students can learn to read with high quality evidence-aligned instruction. And I like to think of that as kind of our North Star. And that's what we at 95% Group stand on as our foundation. So we are honored tonight to welcome two visionaries who stand on that foundation as well. Now at 95% Group, we're starting a series that we're calling Courageous Leaders. And I cannot think of two more courageous leaders than Kimiana Burke and Kelly Butler. And it's our privilege to host them in telling their story about literacy rising in Mississippi. And I know it will inspire everyone who's with us tonight. So let me start by introducing these two women that I consider friends, colleagues, and true literacy warriors. Kelly Butler is the Chief Executive Officer at the Barksdale Reading Institute. Prior to joining Barksdale, Kelly was the Executive Director of Parents for Public Schools, a national organization founded in Mississippi, and she was a teacher in Greenwich, Connecticut public schools. She has worked extensively with a variety of nonprofit organizations in social service, healthcare, and education in the areas of program development, support, and evaluation. And I just have to say, on a personal note, I've had the pleasure of working with Kelly on the Science of Reading short course, and she and I are also fellow peaceniks for literacy. So welcome, Kelly.
Thank you, Laura.
Dr. Kimiana Burke, Senior Policy Fellow for Early Literacy at the Foundation for Excellence in Education, Excel and Ed, supports a comprehensive approach to K-3 reading policy by assisting leaders in building or improving K-3 reading policies and implementation. Prior to this position, she has served as the Executive Director for the Office of Teaching and Learning in the Jackson Public School District in Jackson, Mississippi, where she also began her teaching career over 20 years ago. And notably, Kimiana also served as the State Literacy Director for the Mississippi Department of Education, where she led the statewide implementation of Mississippi's Literacy-Based Promotion Act from 2013 to 2019. And I've gotten to know Kimiana when we've had the pleasure of speaking alongside of each other at a couple of state initiatives. So welcome, Kimiana. And I will turn it over to Kelly.
Thank you, Laura and 95% Group, and good evening, everybody. I'm really happy to be in this conversation with my friend and colleague, Kimiana Burke, who is one of the most amazing women I've ever worked with, and I'm on record as saying that every state needs a Kimiana Burke. Thanks to Excel and Ed, she's now able to share her expertise in literacy policy and acumen and implementation with other states. So I'm always happy to be in her presence and be working with her. I want to share this slide to start with this slide. Like so many others, Emily Hanford's initial 4-part series about reading in America's schools cast the first light on what was happening on the ground, and in this case, Mississippi. What I like about this headline is the declaration that there is a right way to teach reading, because one of the contributions that the Barksdale Reading Institute made to the Mississippi literacy story was our insistence early on that there is a science, including cognitive science, in how to teach reading. And here's what can happen if you take the science seriously and you apply it consistently. Charts on the next two slides illustrate the trajectory of Mississippi's 4th grade reading over 20 years. In 2003, we ranked 49th among all states. In 2019, we reached the national average not a short slog or an easy lift, but we got to 29th and well off the bottom. In 2022, the most recent administration of NAEP, and in spite of a pandemic, we have moved above the middle of the pack to 21st. This chart shows movement over 20 years of Mississippi's African-American fourth graders on NAEP, from 7th from the bottom in 2003 to 5th from the top in 2022. On the left side, African-American students lagged behind their white peers by 30 points in 2003. But on the right side, this gap had closed by 10 points over the 20 years. Of course, we must pick up the pace if we're going to close this gap completely. As we say in the Barksdale Reading Institute, never confuse progress with victory. Now, one advantage of being the oldest person on every Zoom call is that I have the longest view of this literacy work. The Mississippi story begins well before the passage of our Literacy-Based Promotion Act, which Kimiana will be explaining in great detail. This account begins in 2000, the year the National Reading Panel report was published and the Barksdale Reading Institute was established with a $100 million investment by Jim Barksdale and his late wife, Sally. Before there was a Reading First and a No Child Left Behind, before there was letters, and before there was a third grade law, BRI was on the ground with a singular mission to significantly improve early reading instruction. All signs pointed to embedding the science of reading into every level of Mississippi's education system, including teacher preparation. We started there by funding the early literacy faculty positions in 8 public institutions to attempt to change how new teachers were being trained from the outset. More about this in a moment. Drawing on the work that was happening in Florida and Alabama at the time, the Barksdale team designed and tested a number of elements that proved effective in changing teacher practice. We brought in the best and brightest in the field to train our 30 regional coaches. Researchers such as Marilyn Adams, Joe Torgeson, Mark Seidenberg, and Barbara Foreman helped make BRI an engine of the science. I call this the R&D phase of the Mississippi Miracle. The pilot included intensive professional development, coaching, and data-driven interventions, 3 features that would go to scale with the passage of the Literacy-Based Promotion Act a dozen years later. Every year, U.S. colleges of education graduate 1.5 million new teachers in the nation's classrooms. As elementary majors, 42% of them are expected to teach reading. And yet very little is known about what's happening in teacher preparation. It was time to see if funding faculty positions was incentive enough. It was time to look under the hood. Beginning in 2003, Barksdale conducted the first deep dive of teacher preparation content and delivery in Mississippi's 8 public programs. The findings were stark and troubling. At the completion of the study in 2005, NAEP scores stood at 204, and Mississippi ranked next to last above Puerto Rico for 4th grade reading. This study, the first of 2, led to a licensure change to ensure that pre-service candidates were at least being exposed to the 5 components of reading. That tells you something about what we found. Barksdale lobbied the State Licensure Commission to require a minimum of 6 hours in early literacy preparation. And we worked with the Higher Ed Literacy Council to create a template for 2 courses that are still required today. I'd like to think that this measure alone resulted in the first incline in NAEP scores, but it was during this period that the Mississippi Adequate Education formula was fully funded twice, once in 2003 and again in 2007. It has not been fully funded since. There's a bit of plateau around 2010 when the state adopted Common Core standards, renamed College and Career Readiness Standards. Not that state standards were detrimental or even resisted. Rather, the State Department and the schools needed time for the gargantuan shift in instruction to align with these new standards, as well as begin work on a new state test that was more aligned with NAEP. During this period, BRI shifted its focus to school leadership as a lever for changing and sustaining teacher practice. 2013 was a monumental year. 4 big things happened. The state introduced a kindergarten screener so that we had statewide data on school entry for the first time. This accompanied a new law instituting early learning collaboratives, which Dr. Burke will explain a little bit later. The Literacy-Based Promotion Act, our third grade law, was enacted, and the indomitable Carrie Wright was appointed state superintendent. One of her first moves was to hire Kimiana Burke as state literacy director. She was charged with implementing the new law. At the governor's request, Barksdale loaned the department 2 senior specialists to assist with designing the rollout. With these stars aligned, the booster rockets were ignited. Pay attention to this important baseline. NAEP scores stood at 209, and Mississippi still languished 4th from the bottom, ahead of New Mexico, DC, and Puerto Rico. As the state was poised to deliver high quality professional development in the form of letters and deliver school-based coaching targeting teachers in K-3 classrooms, Barksdale appealed to the Commissioner of Higher Education to revisit what was happening in teacher preparation and determine if the 6 hours of reading that had been instituted back in 2005 were sufficient, meaning accurate and substantive. After all, the legislature had just appropriated $9 million to retrain in-service teachers in evidence-based practices. This funding would rise to a $15 million annual appropriation the next year. But good stewardship demanded to know how we were failing pre-service candidates who entered our classrooms every year unprepared to teach reading. This time, the study included all 15 institutions, public and private. With pressure from the commissioner, the deans agreed and the private institutions opted in. Again, the reviews were underwhelming. In 2016, the legislature mandated a new reading instruction assessment as a requirement for teacher licensure. At the time, Mississippi was one of a dozen states pulling this lever for change. Since 2015, approximately 20 states have added a licensure test well-grounded in the science of reading. I'm sure Kimiana has an updated number on that. In 2017, concerned about low passage rates on the impending licensure exam, and disturbed by the most recent findings of Barksdale's study, the governor formed a task force to ensure that the study's findings were addressed. The second study indicated that while programs were recognizing the 5 components of reading, reading content was still not adequately or accurately addressed. And most of the faculty knew very little about the science of reading. Several had still not read the National Reading Panel report. Some had never heard of it. Others rejected it outright. This led to the development of a professional growth model for faculty. Barksdale appealed to the State Department, that means Kimiana, to secure 40 slots from the state's letters contract so that we could create a faculty-only cohort for training. This became the anchor for the professional growth model, which also included on-site coaching, modeling, and revision of course syllabi. We tapped the best letters trainer in the country, Antonio Fierro, and launched with Kellogg Foundation support, the Mississippi Momentum Partnership. Today, Antonio has trained and visited more than 50 faculty members from elementary, special education, and early childhood programs. Emily Hanford spent a series of days in Mississippi observing and interviewing. You can hear these faculty voices learning to segment words into phonemes on her September 2018 podcast, Hard Words. The long view brings us to 2019, when Mississippi reached the national average for 4th grade reading and a new ranking of 29th among all states. This milestone and Hanford's media coverage generated interest from across the country. Carrie and Kimiana fielded hundreds of calls about the 3rd grade law. Barksdale fielded calls about fixing teacher preparation. Synergy from these calls precipitated the Path Forward, a multi-state initiative we formed and funded in partnership with the Belt Foundation and the Hunt Institute in North Carolina. Supported by an impressive National Advisory Board of reading experts, we designed a state team approach comprised of representatives from the agencies that shared responsibility, if not accountability, for early literacy achievement. The path forward has the singular goal of embedding the science of reading into educator preparation programs. Of course, we were encouraged by the latest NAEP administration, delayed by a year due to the pandemic. Although the country had slipped as a whole, Mississippi scored above the national average and now ranks 21st among all states. An indicator to us that the floor is solid, but this is no time to let our foot off the gas. As the Reading Institute is scheduled to sunset at the end of this month, we are passing the baton to several partners with whom we have worked over the years. The path forward, the multi-state initiative for teacher prep, is in the good hands of the Hunt Institute. This summer, Cohort 2 will present their action plans for change, and interested states are invited to send representatives to learn about this work. If you are interested in knowing more about how your state can be considered for a future cohort, I encourage you to reach out to the Hunt Institute. And finally, BRI's signature legacy project is the Reading Universe. This is a new and free website for pre-K through 6th grade teachers and university faculty, built on the vast amount of educational material and tools we used in Mississippi schools and teacher prep programs during the 2 decades leading up to the Literacy-Based Promotion Act. Partnering with WETA, PBS's flagship station, and you will know them by Reading Rockets, and First Book, an international organization familiar to teachers and service providers of low-income children, we will launch a K-1 prototype on July 20th at the National Teach Conference of AFT in Washington. You can get a sneak preview by going to readinguniverse.org for a short video tour of the site. And that brings us back to the welcomed interest of the media and the publics that's fueling a reading revolution. In February of this year, Nicholas Kristof weighed in on this national conversation. His story echoes the earlier messages broadcast by Emily Hanford in her series, that there is a right way to teach reading. And then Mr. Kristof paid us a visit last month to see for himself. Of course, the Reading Institute has done all of this with essential partners along the way, not the least of which was Kimiana Burke and her team. But thanks to the generosity and perspicacity of Jim Barksdale, the nimbleness of the Institute allowed us to test elements of a model that were ready to go when the funded mandate happened. And this set the stage for state policy that was a requisite to Mississippi's success. My biggest takeaway from this long view is that you can lift a state off the bottom if you do what science tells you works and everyone rows in the same direction. I'm eager for you to hear now from my soulmate, Kimiana Burke, to tell you what rowing together looks like in the poorest but feistiest state in the country. But before I turn it to my warrior sister, I'll bring in another warrior sister, Laura Stewart, to tell you a little bit about the 95% group.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you so much, Kelly. You know, well, first of all, I'm glad you called out the journalists, Emily Hanford and Nicholas Kristof. They've been really important voices in helping drive this mission to all citizens. You know, we're all invested in this. And, you know, what you said, we're all rowing in the same boat, in the same direction. And the facets that you pulled out, the teacher prep, licensure, early screening, teacher training and coaching, strong leadership, legislation, it really takes all those things, right? Yeah. So, you know, what's exciting to me at this moment is when I think about this Mississippi model and what you've helped build is kind of a groundswell, I think, Kelly, of enacting the evidence and enacting what we know is right instructionally to make a difference in children's lives on a widespread basis. So thank you so much for that. You know,
Laura, I think one of the encouraging things about this is that every state has all of the levers that we pulled in Mississippi. They all have them. They have a legislature, they have a state board, they have superintendent, they have philanthropy, they have university faculty. We just got them all rowing in the same direction.
Exactly. Yeah. And, you know, I can tell you just on a smaller basis, we at the 95% group have had a chance to really experience that in certain transformational districts where districts are pulling together all those invested parties. You know, we've worked in Fulton County, Georgia, and Valverde, California, and Canyons, Utah. And those same elements that you're calling out are really at play: leadership and teacher knowledge and classroom curriculum. So thank you for just shedding a light on all of this for us. And there's so many great comments, by the way. I was looking at the chat, so many supportive comments in the chat. I saw someone from Mississippi who had recently retired, and she wrote, "Mississippi proud." So there you go. Also, thank you very much, Kelly. And now let's turn over to Kimiana.
Well, good evening, everyone. I am just so excited to join my sisters in this fight tonight as we are talking about just improving literacy outcomes for all students across the country. And I'll start off by saying the Literacy-Based Promotion Act and its components were just very clear about what needed to be done, right? So there are so many states that will call and say, well, we want to do what Mississippi did. What did you all do, right? So there's a checklist about what needs to be done, what these fundamental principles are of what we consider a comprehensive early literacy policy that we've developed at Excel in Ed. But what my team and I had to develop coming on board in 2013 is how it would be done. And I want to start off by saying that infrastructure is key. There are some instances in some states where, you know, there may be one person at the Department of Education, right, who doesn't have a support system. You know, a team like I had, by the time I left, I had maybe 80 coaches, right, in over 180 schools in the state. I had a core leadership team, and in some places they don't have that type of support. So taking on something like this, something with all of the components that are needed in order to really implement an effective model, cannot be someone else's add-on, right? It can't be someone's add-on to their job. Like, there has to be a dedicated hub for even monitoring the progress of, you know, how this is going. So I'm going to talk about the how. Now, I apologize. I'm in New York today, and the weather, if you've seen anything about the smoke and those things here, they really kind of have my sinuses going. So I apologize in advance for all the sniffling that I'm about to do tonight. So this is just a great example that shows all the different components of the model. And I will start by saying that any state that adopts a read by 3 model, this is not just a 3rd grade teacher's responsibility. And we want to be very clear about that, that these supports and accommodations and services, all of these things that we're going to provide for our teachers and administrators, our students and our parents and families should not begin in 3rd grade. These things should begin in kindergarten. We should have it to where a kindergarten teacher kind of passes the child along like a baton to say, I've gotten him or her ready for you, right? Next grade, and then the next grade after that. So all of these things that I'm going to talk about tonight are really focused on ensuring that as soon as students enter school, as early as kindergarten and with our early learning collaboratives pre-K, that all of these things are present. Some students, it's not because they have a lack of ability, right? It's because they have a lack of opportunity and access. And we want all children to have access to these things. So first, we really kind of think about these supports in the terms of maybe 4 buckets. And the first one is, how do we support our teachers and administrators? Through the RFP process, we selected letters training when we first began this effort in 2013, because we had to develop a common language for what it meant to teach reading. So whether you're in North Mississippi or South Mississippi, we had to know for sure that our teachers understood the science of reading, how reading and writing develop, all of those things. We also used letters trainers. Now, some states may adopt the trainer model. We did not have that luxury. We did not want any information to be lost in translation. So we used strictly letters training throughout the state. And we really had initially a very short window of time to do that, right? Because our retention component of the law was 2 years away. So when we first passed the law, I always say my first years was PR. My first 2 years was PR, because we had to not only convince our stakeholders that what we were doing was best for what was best for children, we had to really kind of prove ourselves, you know, and get buy-in and really say to them, we're going to help you along the way. Because this was the first state-led effort where we had boots on the ground in the form of literacy coaches, and I'll talk about that in a minute, who were in schools, you know, in their business, right? And initially there was some pushback, you know, that was, okay, the State Department is in my building, but we had to prove that we were there to help them, to assist them. So with educator training, we begin with our lowest performing schools that we call our literacy support schools, our schools that were assigned literacy coaches. And we begin with letters training, a year-long, you know, phase 1, phase 2, and we even had a phase 3 on-site training so that we could begin to build that knowledge and build the capacity for our teachers to be able to teach reading. Now, our faculty came along a bit later. I think that it was when we put some accountability in higher ed for the first time in 2016 with the idea that candidates had to pass this assessment of the science of reading, our Foundations of Reading test. And then this really put some accountability in the higher ed space where we had not had that accountability before. And of course, with Barksdale and the team and our Higher Ed Literacy Council, we were really able to bring our faculty together. And that's a very important role that Barksdale played with being able to begin providing training to faculty. Because I will say this, we take for granted when we say that we want to change educator preparation program coursework. I think that we just kind of take for granted, or we think that we want to change the coursework, but we really haven't thought about how we can support the faculty in making this switch. Because if all of our faculty were teaching the science of reading, our candidates or our teachers would exit programs knowing these things already, and we wouldn't have to do so much training, right? So we have to make sure that we're putting those supports where needed as far as building faculty knowledge. So the next component is coaching, all right? Coaching for our teachers, which ended up in some cases being coaching for our administrators as well, where we developed a model where it includes the feedback loop. It includes how to document your supports and services, you know, how to look at data, not just your quantitative data, but anecdotal data. There were some cases where a 3rd grade class may have had 6 teachers in 1 year because there was a teacher out in FMLA or there were substitute teachers. All of those things have to be considered when we're thinking about student outcomes. You know, how consistent, you know, has there been, you know, a teacher in the classroom? All of those things really matter. So we've made sure that with our coaching model that we were able to include all of these different components in recruiting coaches. I'll say too, for states, that wasn't very easy in the beginning because we were not in a place as a state where a lot of our teachers knew the science of reading. So one thing that we wanted to do was to ensure that our coaches not only had the knowledge of the science of reading, but they could also play well with other adults. Because coaching is really about how you build relationships first so that teachers can trust you and that they can feel comfortable with even taking your advice, right? So the coaching model and how we were able to engage with teachers on site was key to building those relationships and getting buy-in from those teachers who are standing in front of kids every day. The next component is going to go into the bucket of how we support our students. Early identification. Early identification is key. Universal screening 3 times per year, screening for characteristics of dyslexia. In our state, we have separate dyslexia legislation, and in some states, their dyslexia requirements are included in their read by 3 or their literacy laws. So for us, our students are screened for characteristics of dyslexia at the end of kindergarten, the beginning of 1st grade, and also, you know, opportunities for other students who are identified or that teachers or parents may think may have characteristics of dyslexia. They also have opportunities to be screened as well. As a part of this early identification, and Kelly alluded to it earlier, so not just with the Literacy-Based Promotion Act, but our Early Learning Collaboratives Act passed also during the same time. This was major for Mississippi because we do not have a fully funded kindergarten. We also do not have, we do not have fully funded pre-K. And with early learning collaboratives, our legislature committed to providing monies to these collaboratives, which are partnerships that are formed with a public school, with either the Head Start or a pre-K, public or private pre-K. And they all make that commitment that those students who are exiting pre-K are ready for kindergarten. They follow the same model as our K-3 model. There's a literacy coach, there's curriculum, there's all of these supports that are provided to these collaboratives. And that number has grown, including with funding. I think we're now at over 20 collaboratives and many millions of dollars. I forgot where we are now. We started with 3 million. I think it may have been about 16 million the last time I checked, where they're funding our early learning collaboratives, getting our 4-year-olds ready for kindergarten. So again, early identification is key. And also with students, I'm going to skip down to individual reading plans. For those students who are identified early who need additional support, individual reading plans, which was an amendment added to our law in 2016, ensures that those students are getting the right interventions and that we're monitoring the impact of those interventions. And if they're not working, then we have to make sure that we're doing something else, right? We can't just continue to provide interventions that are not meeting the needs of our students. So ensuring that our students are getting the supports that they need, but also included in that is making sure that the teachers have this high quality curriculum that excludes 3 cueing instructional practices. And we in Mississippi, I always say we kind of came late to the curriculum game. What happened to us, because we're very reflective, we listen to the field. Our teachers were saying that they were going to training and then they were coming back into their classrooms, but their materials were not aligned to this new learning, right? So they're learning about the science of reading, structured literacy, and they come back and they see 3 cueing strategies, or they see running records, or they see these other things. And they're, so really just out of a response and where we were moving as a nation, and especially being next door to Louisiana, who had started this HQIM journey, then we begin to look more at, okay, we're building knowledge, we're changing all of these other things. How can we ensure that we are getting the right curriculum in the hands of our teachers? And so then the other bucket is, of course, our parents and families. Parental notification is key. You say to yourself, well, why would you have to put in the policy that we have to notify parents? Well, there are too many instances where parents are not notified until the end of the school year that their child is not performing well and that he or she may be retained. And that's in any grade, right? So with our law, parents are notified within 30 days as soon as students are screened. And if they are identified with a reading deficiency, parents must be notified. They must also receive strategies as to how they can help their children at home. Schools will let parents know how they're going to help. And then parents are, of course, a part of the individual reading plan. And we have an entire website dedicated to parents and other stakeholders, community members, those who want to support students, called Strong Readers, Strong Leaders. And then the last component, which is always the elephant in the room, is that Mississippi does have a retention component to its law. Retention being an intervention strategy. I always say that, here we focus on prevention and intervention and not retention, because honestly, if all of these things are done, as soon as students enter kindergarten, they are identified early, they're provided with all of these supports, then the degree to which we are retaining students, right, should not increase. It should decrease, which is what we have been able to see really over the years here in Mississippi. So prevention as an intervention strategy. And one thing I just want to note, when we begin the school year after we've screened students, we know within the first 30 days of school, which children are at risk for reading failure. So we can't continue to say that, oh, wow, at the end of the year, we have these kids who are not performing. We know who these kids are. We know them by name, and we need to make sure that we are providing them with the supports that they need. Next slide. So I always say that our biggest strategy, our most impactful strategy was that we invested in people. You have to invest in those people who are standing in front of children every day. And I love headlines just like the other KB, right? We love our headlines. All of the thank goodness for Mississippi. I go to some states now when I'm testifying, you know, and you'll have a legislator say, I always used to say thank God for Mississippi. And I'm like, yep, that's not funny anymore. But we also always talk about how, you know, yeah, we understood that, and we understood where we were. And now we're just really kind of, you know, just blessed to be in a position to share some of the things that we've learned, so that others can do these things for all kids. And so when you look at my chart, which is of course not as fancy as Kelly's, but when you look at my chart with the LBPA enacted in 2013, I think there's one thing that, you know, the country has missed. Our law was passed in 2013, and we were at a scale score of 209. In 2015, 2 years later, we actually increased our scale score from 209 to 214, which is 5 scale score points. And this is more than we actually increased from 27 to 2019, when we increased 4 scale score points. So there was a lot of talk about, well, you know, they had these retained kids and this is why the scores, but no, we began very slowly increasing our skill scores, and our students began to perform well, and our retention rate was beginning to decrease. All of those things were happening very slowly. But I think that it really caught the attention of the country in 2019, when Mississippi became the only state that was able to see those statistically significant gains, and of course, meet the national average for the very first time. Next slide. So the Mississippi Miracle, we have some feelings about that. Only because it shouldn't take a miracle for children to learn to read, regardless of where they are. Kelly showed some slides earlier that really spoke to the performance of our low-income students, or the performance of our students of color. And I say that in 2019, and possibly why it's so intriguing to a lot of people, I felt like in 2019, Mississippi proved that when adults are on the same page, students benefit. You can be poor, Black, or Hispanic and learn to read. And lastly, knowledge is power. For those who are charged with this very important work of teaching children to read and really changing the trajectory of their lives, knowledge is power. All right, next slide. So post-pandemic, Mississippi's early literacy landscape, and I see that my friend and colleague and current state literacy director, Kristen Wynn, is a member of this meeting tonight. Kristen took over this amazing work in 2019. She began with us as a literacy coach in 2013. So one thing that's also extremely important about what we've been doing here is kind of consistency in leadership. So when I left, Kristen was able to take the helm and actually lead the state in literacy during a pandemic. So kudos to you, my friend. And so what's Mississippi's early literacy landscape now? Kelly mentioned earlier and showed the slides about where we are. For the first time, Mississippi passed the national scale score, scored 1 point above at 217. We're in the top 5 for Black, Hispanic, and low-income student performance across the country. And we do know that there is still so much work to be done. So understand we're talking about our progress to this point, but we know that, again, until we have at least 95% of our students who are performing well, until we can completely close these achievement gaps, then we know that our work is not done. But when people kind of ask me, well, how do you keep going, and what's your motivation, and all of those things, and I always say that now that we have seen this done, you can't unsee it. We no longer have an excuse as to why children can't. We no longer can just continue to talk about this achievement gap like it's going to be this thing that's going to be around forever, when we now know what to do to ensure that our children can become just the citizens in our community that we know that they can, and really have a great quality of life. All right, next slide. And I will turn it over back to you, Peggy.
Laura, are you there?
I'm here. Okay, so Kelly and I were talking about Atul Gawande. Some of you might know the book Checklist Manifesto. And we were talking about, wouldn't it be great if as teachers, we had a checklist manifesto, something that we go to and we check up just to make sure that we're flying safe. Because in Atul Gawande's book, it's all about how pilots use a checklist every time without fail to make sure that everything's ready to go, all systems go. Here's what we need to do to be safe. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we could have kind of that same checklist manifesto to make sure we're on the right track every time with the choices we have to make? And how, we as teachers, we're faced with, I read somewhere, teachers are faced with 1,000 decisions a day that they have to make. And how do we know what are those, what's kind of a roadmap for those best decisions? So we thought, evidence-aligned actions in the foundational skills would include phonological awareness, review, introduce patterns, practice, read connected text, all of these things that really need to be done on a daily basis in an effective instructional plan. So next slide. So as we were building this checklist manifesto, I said, well, interestingly enough, Kelly, this is the 95 Phonics Core Program lesson components. And you can also, some of you who have been through letters probably recognize this lesson plan. This is a lesson plan that is used in letters module 3. That includes just those items that are really critical for a checklist manifesto. So I encourage you, I know there's been a lot of chat around programs and resources to use in the classroom, and I encourage you to check out 95% group resources and think of it as kind of your checklist manifesto of effective instruction. Anything else you want to say about that, Kelly?
No, I think you covered it well. One of the things I learned from Atul Gawande, who's a surgeon, was when he set out to fix what was happening in operating rooms. He was curious to know that, surgeons would enter the operating theater and just begin to do what they do without checking some very basic things. And the work that he did in the third world changed the mortality rate of, it dramatically dropped almost to nothing just by instituting these very basic things that surgeons needed to make sure were in place before and during surgery. And it just occurred to me that we ought to have one for reading. So thank you, Laura, for putting that list together.
You betcha. Okay, so I believe we have some additional resources that are going to be made available. And Barbara, I think you're putting those in the chat, I believe.
Yes, I dropped
yes,
it in the chat.
Exactly. So,
And we'd love Dr. Burke. So I'm sorry, Laura. We'd love for Dr. Burke to share a little more information about what the perfect storm was all about. And then Kelly, if you can talk about 10 maxims.
Okay, sure, of course. When was this? 2020, right? I was writing during the pandemic. 2020, I was fortunate enough to write an article for the Reading League, just about Mississippi's journey, all of those things that I mentioned earlier. It's written in this article called The Perfect Storm, Mississippi's Momentum for Improving Reading Achievement, all the things that really came together at the right time. And I always say we had to go big or go home, but came together at the right time for us to begin to make change. And it seems like some of the players, especially Kelly, and we're all still in this work, fighting to ensure that Mississippi continues on this path. And then also now, it's excelling it for me, ensuring that other states are able to get on this path as well.
That's a great article, Kimiana. And if you go to it, you will see what I call the vintage version of Reading Universe, which is the work that we did early on and now are turning into a web-based service for teachers. So that takes us to the 10 maxims, which are now posted on Reading Universe. You also may have seen them recently in a blog, the National Council for Teacher Quality. Reed Lyon, who was chief of early child development and behavior for the National Institute of Child Development back in the early late 1980s and 90s and into 2000. He led the massive amount of research that went on early in the days when we were beginning to put 2 and 2 together about cognitive science and how we teach reading. And over the course of the last year, Reed reached out to some of us. He had been getting contacted by media, thanks again to our friends in the media, who were asking him about this reading science and were we back in a war and what was this all about? And through several conversations and a web kind of a web conversation we host at the Reading Institute every Friday between researchers and practitioners, he came and shared with us some of the key things that he knew from the 30, 40 years of research. And so we asked him if he could cull that down to 10 maxims. I call them Reed's maxims. And if you go on the Reading Universe website, you can find them there. There are 10 statements that are unequivocal about what we know about reading and reading instruction. And there's a URL code attached to it that will produce the 30 pages of research that are aligned to each of the 10 maxims. So for any of you who are still doubting about what this science is that we're talking about, Reed's really done us a great service by pulling it together, and he should know because his view is longer than mine.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you, Kelly. So here's our contact information, but before I think we have a few minutes that we could maybe take a couple questions. Ladies, are you up for some questions?
Sure.
All righty, so beyond parent notification, what else was utilized to actively involve parents? And I believe you covered this, Kenyana, but maybe you could just say again.
Sure. So we had what we called a road show where the team would go. I know our first year, and we continued each year after that. We had 8 areas of the state that we would visit and have parent meetings, because it was extremely important for parents to understand the law, understand the expectations, and of course for us to get the buy-in that we needed, and to just really explain that first year that students would be retained. My daughter Kirsten was in that first cohort of students, and so it was extremely important to me to ensure that parents understood the purpose and of course how we would help. So we had parent meetings across the state where we talked directly to parents. It started at 6 p.m. It was over at 7 p.m. Allowed them to ask questions and also showed them some strategies that they can use with their children at home. And then of course, in addition to the website and other resources like push cards, we created read at home plans. So supporting our parents was just extremely important, and we had to make sure that we developed resources that could do that.
Great.
I think an important point about that too, let me jump in, is to say that one of the things we tested, we learned a lot of lessons, good and bad, in those 20 years or 13 years leading up to the act, is that Barksdale funded some very elaborate parent resource centers. And it was one of the things that we determined was not successful. All of the Barksdale schools had these beautiful, well-stocked centers, and our expectation was that parents would flock to them. And rarely did parents come. And the lesson there being, you have to be proactive. You got to go where they are. And Kenyana did that in her implementation.
Absolutely. You have to meet people where they are, for sure. Another question was about the teacher shortage. Have you seen any impact with teacher shortages?
I've talked to Kristen about this at length. I think for us, our shortage really we have a lot of areas that are rural areas, hard to staff areas. We've partnered with Teach for America. If you're on, thank you so much for your partnership. We've partnered a lot with Teach for America to staff our hard to staff areas in our state, especially our Delta areas. I think for the pandemic though, there were, of course, the results of that, where there were coaches who were saying, you know what, I'm either going to go back into the classroom or now it's time for me to retire, because our coaches really go from school to school. They may have 2 schools, and then being there in person, visiting classrooms. And for some people, they didn't want to do that. So the MDE under Kristen's leadership created a virtual coaching model. Like, there are some great things going on, y'all.
Right.
Created a virtual coaching model for even some of those administrators who were saying, we don't want people who are going around to these other schools, right, coming into our school around our kids, and all of those things for safety reasons, as far as health and those things were concerned. And so there was a virtual coaching model that was developed out of a need for that. So I think that one thing that the pandemic has done for us is to say, okay, we can get on Zoom now. There are ways in which we can reach people very quickly that we haven't really been able to do before. So I think we're still kind of seeing the impact of that, but we've had shortage areas in Mississippi, I think, for a very long time.
Okay.
I would say also that we have some pretty innovative principals who are growing their own, that they are turning paraprofessionals and encouraging them, because many of them had to step into the classroom and are always playing that supportive role. And I think we've had some good success with getting those paraprofessionals into the pipeline.
That's good. Kelly, do you mind putting back up the contact information? Because we've had a couple of people in the chat ask for the contact information. And while you're doing that, can you, Kimiana or Kelly, describe the leadership training for principals and district leaders? And you might have covered this, but I think we had a couple of people ask for a little bit more on that.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I can start.
Yeah.
Okay. This is extremely important, and I'll make it quick. I know we're kind of short on time. When we first started, we adopted, we had letters training for the last 9 years. Last year, we did adopt AIM pathway. So we can talk more about that. But we adopted letters training, and then we also adopted the leadership component to that. I think that's the principal's primer part of it.
Yeah.
And the one thing that we did was, with the principal's primer, it talks about, it kind of gives background on the science of reading, but it was really more about literacy leadership and being able to establish the 90-minute or the 120-minute reading block, or MTSS, how you're identifying kids and supporting students and all of that. But one thing that we found was that our administrators were saying, well, I still don't know about the science of reading, right? I'm going through this administrator training. So we took for granted, which I think a lot of places do, that you're an administrator at an elementary school, you should know this. So we're just going to have a separate training for you, right? So that's the one thing that we kind of did very quickly with feedback from our administrators. We began to make sure that they also attended letters training so that they could also learn about the science of reading. Now, with the training that the state has adopted through AIM pathways, there's a leadership pathway that still focuses on the science of reading in addition to literacy leadership. And then there's, of course, the pathway for the educators. So please make sure that you are intentionally providing the support and building the knowledge of those administrators, because they are the ones who are going to hold teachers responsible and accountable for changing their practice. They can't do that if they don't know what they're looking at when they go into those classrooms, right? And they don't know how to give feedback for that. So principals are coaches too. So not just evaluators. So we want to make sure that we equip our administrators to be able to support teachers in that way.
Thank you for that. I think one of you said earlier, knowledge is power. And I think the research is pretty clear that with principals, you can't just have a checklist, an observation checklist. You have to know the content yourself, right? And I think that's what you're speaking to, is helping our leaders know the content as well as what to look for in the classrooms to support teachers. Yeah, and make a commitment, to creating a schedule in which we can invest in an MTSS model, making a commitment to professional learning of teachers, making a commitment to curriculum resources. One thing you mentioned, Kimiana, that really struck home to me at 95% group is a lot of times teachers might build their knowledge base and then go back into classrooms where they don't have materials with which they can enact that knowledge base. And that creates a huge disconnect. So making sure that the resources that teachers have are evidence aligned and evidence-based. In other words, have efficacy studies as well as aligned to the research. So I wish we could just go on and on. We've got additional questions, but you can follow up. Here's our contact information. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I think about so many of the key points that you both made. One of the things that got a lot of amens is lack of opportunity, not lack of ability. And I think that's such an important thing to remember. Invest in people. Well, someone wrote in the chat, Yes, the right people in the right place doing the right thing. Another thing you wrote, I mentioned, aligning curriculum materials with the science. And finally, something you mentioned, there is still work to be done, but there's no excuses and failure is not inevitable. So thank you so much for giving us this long story, this wonderful journey, this hard work that you've done. It's truly inspiring. And we thank you for that. And everyone else for joining us. We just really appreciate the time tonight. And we hope that this has been helpful and hopeful for all of you joining us. So from 95% Group, I just want to say thank you and have a good evening.